me all right? Okay. I'm going to start us and welcome everybody. It's a little unique to try to do both in person and Zoom shiur, but that is our attempt for a couple of the shiurim this year. I'm going to begin with primarily an introduction today, and if we get to some text, we'll arrange for that to be screen shared or handouts if necessary. Okay? What prompted me to give a class called, as I did, in this way, From Torah to Mitzvah? Okay? Well, I want to just give a word of introduction to that first by saying that I always wonder if when people follow the Torah reading during the weekly parsha, they see a pasuk, okay, and then they wonder basically what was derived from that pasuk, or what was the mitzvah. How did that pasuk become the basis of a mitzvah? And as I thought about it, I realized that perhaps I'm not the only one that ever was concerned about that idea, and that perhaps there would be some text that would help us understand that progression, if you will. Okay? From where do we start with a pasuk like you should not see or cook a calf in its mother's milk, or a mitzvah of peru urvu, be fruitful and multiply. Okay, let's take that initially as an example. And how does that particular verse in the Torah become established as a whole category of halakha? Okay? And so that's what motivated me to look for a text that we could look at certain examples and try to determine a little bit how that happens. Okay? So that was the motivation that established my decision to have us study what's called Sefer HaChinuch, okay? The book of mitzvah education. Okay? And if you were to look that up in Wikipedia or any other kind of source, you'd see that it really is a book that lists all 613 mitzvot. I'm not going to talk about all of them, believe me, but just a number of them. And then attempts, after listing them, breaking them up into which mitzvot are in which parsha. And today we are going to talk a little bit about that breakdown, the reason, the rationale of the author of the book, and the fact that he then tried to present with this idea that by listening to the parsha each week and by studying his book, you would be able to see what the mitzvot are in a particular parsha, some of the sources connected in the Gemara, okay, or other texts that elaborated on that parsha, on that pasuk, on that verse. And then from there, what is the main purpose, so to speak, what he calls the root of the observance connected with that halakha and how it proceeds. Okay? So, as I say, I'm starting today with a sort of an introduction about what is the Sefer HaChinuch, who is the author, what's the purpose of the book, when do we think it was written, and what are some of the sources that he utilized in terms of his presentation. So that's why I said today is basically introduction. Okay. So it's called Sefer HaChinuch, the book of Mitzvah education. Okay, and as I said, it discusses the 613 mitzvot of the Torah in the order of the portion of the week. And I'll refer to, as I said, that in more detail shortly. The question is, who is the author? What's interesting is both traditional commentaries, and by that I mean, of course, Rishonim, okay, as well as academic scholars, all question who the author is, because the author does not necessarily identify himself in the book. Most want to say that the author was Rabbi Aharon Halevi of Barcelona from the 13th century, a Spanish scholar. Okay? And he was known to be an acknowledged Talmudic scholar and a Rishon. Okay? But traditional scholars like Rabbi Chaim Joseph David Azulai, as well as more contemporary academicians, also question whether he really is the author of the book. They do seem to feel, however, that he must have been an important student of Rabbi Shlomo ben Adrat, the Rashba, because he does cite the Rashba in at least one place in his writings with this idea of a revered teacher and so on and so forth. But what's interesting is that this is not what we would call a book of psak. It's not a book of halakha as we would think in the normal context, where one would ordinarily consider, well, here's the statement, this is the law, so on and so forth. Okay? So, in fact, in the introduction to the book, okay, the author basically explains what his purpose is. He says to us that it's to clarify the 613 mitzvot according to the weekly portions of the written Torah as read each Shabbat in the synagogue. And his desire, apparently, was that it be considered an important book of education for young people, so that they would give more attention to the weekly Torah reading. In fact, he says at one point, he hopes that youngsters of a tender age will ask one another, how many mitzvot are in the Sedra of the week this week? Okay? And here, by writing this book, he would not only tell them which mitzvot are in which Sedra, but define them in more detail. Now, he also tells us that don't think, he says that I'm a master of Talmud, of the Babylonian or the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Midrash, or the Sifra, or the Sifrei, or the Sefer. And he points out that really, and a great deal of humility, okay, that instead he relies on certain other authorities. Okay? And he tells us who those authorities are.
It's just so quiet. It's just so quiet. It's hard to hear you. So I'm going to try to make this louder.
Louder? Okay. All right. So he tells us in his text here. Okay, we're still dealing with some of the technical stuff here. Okay, that he basically chose two main authorities as, aside from the text, as the halachic sources for his explanations. One was Rabbi Isaac Alfazi, okay, and the other Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Now we know, of course, that Maimonides wrote the Mishnah Torah, so that's clearly a Sefer Psak, a halachic code. And Alfazi, the Rif, also has an earlier text, it's earlier than the Rambam, where it basically is what we'll call for the moment, a running commentary on the Talmud, but focusing on the halacha. Okay, any study of Talmud, sometimes at the end of a discussion, it will say, Hilchata, etc., etc. The law is according to Rabbi so-and-so. So what Alfazi did is he would summarize the Shaklavataria, the back and forth, the dialogue that might go on for a page or 2 pages in the Talmud, and then in a short paragraph, and then simply say, and the law is according to so-and-so. So it's interesting that the author of Sefer HaChinuch chose these two main authorities. Now, why is that important for us today? The answer is because if you ask yourself, well, what's the Shulchan Aruch based on? Okay, we know that Yosef Karo decided to use 3 sources as his foundation, as his pillars, so to speak. One was the same, the Rif. One was again the same, the Rambam. And the third that the Shulchan Aruch Yosef Karo used was that of the Rosh. But again, I want us to understand that Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch decided to do a sort of 2 against 1 when he decided who was, how to decide the psak, the decision. Whereas that was not the case here with the Sefer HaChinuch. He's just using 2 authorities as explanation and not to render a legal decision. Now, the contents of the text, first of all, now, we do the 613 mitzvah, but the one that became most accepted was the one written and established by the Rambam in his Sefer HaMitzvot, which is oftentimes found at the beginning of the Mishnah Torah. And so therefore, he then begins to decide and divide up, as we said, how many mitzvot are in each sedra of the week. So I'm going to throw out a little quick question here. Which sedra does anyone think might have the most mitzvot in it? Okay, anyone want to consider? Okay. Right. Well, somebody might suggest, for example, Mishpatim. Okay, after all, that contains a lot of legal examples and legal statements. In actuality, it does have quite a lot. It has 52 different mitzvot in it, but it's not the most, surprisingly. Okay? Ki Tetzei is actually the most, with 74 mitzvot. And so I'll just run through it quickly, share with you an example. Breshit has 1, Lech Lecha 1, Vayishlach 1, Bo 20, Bishalach 1, Yitro 17. And remember, Yitro is the parsha with the 10 commandments in it. Mishpatim 52, Truma 3, Tetzaveh 7, Kitisa 10, Vayakhel Pekude 1, Vayikra 16, Tzav 18, Shmini 17, Tazria 7, Mitzorah 11, Acharemot 28, Kedoshim 51, Amor 63, Bahar 24, Bechukotai 12, Naso 18, Baalotcha 5, Shlach 3, Korach 9, Chukat 3, Pinchas 6, Mato 2, Maseh 6, Dvarim 2, Ba'at Chanan 12, Akev 8, Re'eh 54, Shoftim 41, Kitetse 74, Kitavo 6, and Vayelech 2. Now, what may surprise us, okay, is that in his introduction to the book, he then says, yes, there are these 613 mitzvot, and we normally divide them, okay, into certain positive and negative commandments. It says, but there are only 270 that are required of every Jew, excluding unique circumstances. 248 are positive and 222 are negative. And then he wants us to understand that if you really look at the structure of the mitzvot, you find, he argues, that there are only 6 which are constant. Number 1, to believe in Hashem. Number 2, not to believe in any other God. Number 3, to have faith that Hashem is one. Number 4, to love him. Number 5, to fear and revere him. And number 6, not to go astray following the thought of one's heart or the sight of one's eyes. So again, while he's trying to educate us in terms of the total structure of the mitzvah, he wants to hone in on some specifics. Now we might ask the following question, as he does in his introduction. How do we know what happened at Sinai was valid, was appropriate, was true? Okay? And he says in preparing the book, okay, he began to give thought to this, and he suggests the following as a proof to the veracity of the Torah. He says, if we begin by presenting the idea that those present at Sinai were all eyewitnesses to a unique event, and they in turn, through their oral testimony, passed their experience on to later generations, we can identify that certainly, unfortunately, when we think of the Holocaust, okay? That there were eyewitnesses, people who went through it, and then passed their stories on orally to their children or to others. Okay? Such a visual experience, he argues, is far greater proof than any attempt at logical reasoning or philosophical inquiry. Since humanity possesses certain characteristics shared with lower animals. In other words, one part of the human race was therefore chosen, if you will, okay, to be the recipients of certain divine principles of wisdom in order to give a pathway for the rest of the human race to separate humanity from the animal levels of life. In addition, he says, not only was there this one particular part of the human race, but they were given a special land. And that land was given to them in order to put such principles into action. And in doing so, he suggests, these principles were given in order to develop the spiritual aspects of the human being over the physical aspects that simply serve as a kind of a, if you want to call the body, a vessel, a holder to the soul. And eventually that vessel gets discarded. It's true. And then the soul ultimately reconnects with its origin. It says at the time of the Messiah, we will attain two portions. Both the rejoicing is also the requirement to believe that sense has passed on one generation to the other. That's true meaning is written in the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds. Not only there, but sometimes we find it in other books. And therefore we have books like Midrash Halacha, okay, interpretations of the Torah. The Sifra, which is the halachic midrash on Vayikra, the Sifrei, which is the halachic midrash on Bamidbar and Dvarim, and the Mechilta, the halachic midrash on the Book of Shemot. So according to the author again of Sefer Chinuch, he says all of these mitzvot total 613. The positive ones tell us what to do, the negative what not to do. The positive are 248 in number, and the negative 365 in number. Good way always to remember 248, the number of bones in the body, 365, number of days in a secular year. However, again, he emphasizes that not all mitzvot are incumbent on all people at all times. And then he starts giving us some examples. And I think that's important for us to sort of touch on a little bit. So what kind of examples? Well, he said there's differences within the Jewish community. There are some mitzvot that are only appropriate for a Kohen, as opposed to a non-Kohen. There are some mitzvot that are only appropriate to men and not appropriate with women. There are some mitzvot, he points out, that are associated with living in the land of Israel, as opposed to outside the land of Israel. There are even some, he argues, that depend on specific circumstances. For example, he says if you hire a laborer, okay, certain mitzvot in how you treat that person. Okay? But one is incumbent on all. One mitzvah he suggests that's incumbent on all of us is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, of study of Torah. And in doing so, he wants us to understand that that when following the weekly Torah portion in Shul on Shabbos, we might not necessarily be able to pick up, okay, what is the specific mitzvah, a variety of mitzvah in that sedra, okay? Or what is it, how to carry it out. Where is it important? Where is it to be applied? And so he comes back at the end of his introduction again to why he wrote the book. Okay? The when and the where and the how to properly carry them out. And here too, once more, okay, what he does is he adds in that explanation what he calls the root reason for such a mitzvah. And that's why he began the list, according to the Rambam, with all of them, and then begins to focus on specific ones. So that, I think, gives you some introduction to Sefer HaChinuch, to what we're going to be learning, and the approach of the author. And I'll just conclude this part with just the introduction by pointing out that one of the things that may be particularly surprising to us, okay, is that when he's going to cite a source in, let's say, the Talmud, for example, he will simply say, oh, the sages say, or we find in the Talmud such and such on that topic. And we're going to see this shortly, okay? When in essence, what he's doing is he's cited a single individual, the opinion perhaps of one person, and uses that as an example of an explanation of the verse of the pasuk that he sees as the basis for that mitzvah. So I think that that's important for us to understand in terms of relating to the how we're going to interpret the book and understand some of the sources. Okay, so in the time we have left for today, okay, I'm going to ask Andrea to put the very first source from Sefer Bereshit, okay, onto the screen. I'll be right back.
Did you need me to do screen sharing?
Yeah.
Okay, first.
Okay, so we're going to, which I made up here at the show. Okay, if you're particularly signed up for Rabbi Ron's Zoom show that starts Monday, you can try to fill up at time. If you're interested. The very first exam, right? Okay, I hope those on Zoom can see that all right. We have Hebrew and English version of more on the English text for our purposes. Okay, and then from there you see I made notes, and at times we'll share with everybody. Okay, so he says, of course, what is the first mitzvah? Pru urvu, right? Mitzvah piria v'rivya, be fruitful and multiply. Okay? So he tells us at the outset, there is one positive precept. Precept is his word for mitzvah. Okay, so number one, it tells us how many are in the portion of Bereshit, of Genesis only one mitzvah. Number two, it tells us what kind it is. It's a positive to do, right? The mitzvah of procreation. And notice he's saying, now, having said that, he wants us to understand, well, what's the purpose of this mitzvah? Okay? Is it simply to inhabit the earth? Okay? Or is there more to it than that? So that's where he now begins to explain. And that's what he wants us to understand. So notice where I've marked, okay, in the English there. It is in the order that the world should be settled and inhabited. So same basic root reason for the purpose. Why, we ask? Because he cites then another verse from Isaiah. In other words, that this mitzvah of procreation was given to humanity and not to any other creatures. In other words, not to the animals, not to the angels, things like that. So our first question might be, hey, if that's the case, why marriage? Why can't you just go around, having children with any woman that seems appropriate, whatever, okay? But again, it has to be in a context. So where did he get this idea? He got it from a story in the Babylonian Talmud. And I'll share a brief part of that story. The story says in the Talmud Bavli, Bracha 25b, Rabbi Achai arranged for his son to marry into the family of Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta. He led him to enter the wedding canopy for the wedding ceremony. But he was unsuccessful in his attempts to consummate the marriage. This is the story in the Gemara. Rav Achai followed him to examine possible causes of the problem, and he saw a Torah scroll placed there. In other words, in the house, a Torah scroll was being stored. Okay? He said to them, had I not come now, you would have endangered the life of my son, as it was taught in a Braita, namely, the following. In a room in which there is a Torah scroll, a tefillin, it is forbidden to engage in conjugal relations until he takes them out of the room or places them in a vessel inside a second vessel. So it's based on this story, okay, that we see that number one, the context of to be fruitful and procreate is within the context of marriage, number one. And number two, we also see that from here, okay, he is going to elaborate. Fine, if that's the appropriate context, okay? How do you know it applies to, in what way does it apply to children? Okay, well, we're going to see that momentarily. Because he goes on here to explain to us what are the laws? How is this to be carried out? I'm just checking the clock. Okay. We'll finish up in just a moment. Okay, and we'll start. What are the laws? Number one, a man is duty bound to devote himself to it. So he's telling us, number one, that the mitzvah of procreation is on the man and not on the woman. Number two, how many children he should have in order to have acquitted himself. How do we know that? Okay. Again, citing an example from the Gemara. In Mishnah Avot, he used to say, a 5-year-old begins scripture, a 10-year-old begins Mishnah, a 13-year-old becomes obliged to observe the commandments, a 15-year-old begins the study of Gemara, an 18-year-old goes to the marriage canopy. So the implication clearly is that we might argue at least one son, okay? But other arguments in the Gemara happens to be a machloket argument, Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, one of each. His third point, he goes on, and from which mitzvah is he left free while occupying this? In other words, the Talmud spells out, if you're involved in conjugal relations to fulfill the mitzvah, where are you exempt? And so next time we'll pick up a little bit more, okay, with this topic, okay? Because then he'll say, well, when does this apply? Only certain circumstances, only limited occasions. Where does this approach? When do we continue? And we'll stop right here today and wish everybody well. And thank you for joining. I know that usually I started my shiur with a bracha, la'asok b'divrei Torah. We didn't do that today because we got involved a little bit in some of the technical mechanics, but we wish everybody well and take care.